In February 2026, two United States senators sent an urgent letter to the Pentagon. The subject line was simple: Chinese investors may have secretly acquired stakes in SpaceX. SpaceX is the most valuable private company on Earth, worth over $1 trillion. It builds rockets for NASA, operates a satellite network spanning 155 countries, and holds some of the most classified defense contracts in American history. And yet, according to investigative reports and court testimony, Chinese money found its way inside, routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. This is the story of how that money trail was uncovered, who was behind it, and why it may be one of the most dangerous security blind spots in the world. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand the scale of what SpaceX has become. And to appreciate that scale, consider one number: 10,202. That is how many Starlink satellites are currently orbiting the Earth. Not planned, not in production. In orbit right now, circling the planet every 90 minutes, operating at a 99.9% uptime, providing internet connectivity to over 10 million subscribers across 155 countries. From fishing villages in Indonesia to research stations in Antarctica, Starlink has quietly become one of the most pervasive pieces of infrastructure on Earth, or rather, above it. In the United States alone, residential service costs $120 a month. In South Korea, where Starlink launched in December 2025, the price is 87,000 won. The numbers add up fast. In 2024, SpaceX brought in somewhere between $11.8 and $13.1 billion in revenue. The competition was not even close. Airbus Defence and Space, Europe's largest aerospace contractor, laid off 2,500 employees, largely because it could no longer compete with SpaceX on cost, speed, or capability. Elon Musk holds approximately 42% of SpaceX, but the company is private. It does not file public earnings reports. Its shareholder register is not disclosed. The only way to buy SpaceX shares is through the secondary market, private transactions often brokered through intermediary funds. This will become important later. Then, on February 2, 2026, SpaceX formally acquired xAI, Musk's artificial intelligence company. The combined entity was valued at $1.25 trillion. Rockets, satellites, AI data centers, and the world's largest private intelligence gathering network, all unified under a single corporate structure. It was the largest private merger in history. This was not just a technology company, this was infrastructure, critical infrastructure, the kind governments depend on. And someone, somewhere, had allegedly found a way to buy a piece of it, quietly and through the back door. The question of who actually owns SpaceX is harder to answer than it should be, and that is precisely the point. The first public crack in the wall appeared in March 2025, when ProPublica, the investigative journalism outlet, published a report that would set off a chain of revelations. The core finding was this: Chinese investors wanted to buy shares in SpaceX, but they could not do it directly. SpaceX had an internal policy against selling shares to Chinese nationals, so another route had to be found. Here is where the offshore architecture comes into play. And to follow this trail, it helps to understand how the plumbing of international finance actually works. The Cayman Islands, a small British overseas territory in the Caribbean, roughly 100 miles south of Cuba. Population, about 80,000 people. But registered companies, over 100,000, more legal entities than human beings. The reason is straightforward. The Cayman Islands impose no corporate income tax, no capital gains tax, no withholding tax, and most importantly for this story, very little transparency around who actually owns the entities incorporated there. A fund can be registered in the Caymans, hold billions in assets, and never publicly disclose a single investor name. The British Virgin Islands operate on a similar principle. Combine the two, and you have a system that is, by design, extraordinarily difficult to see through. Layer a Cayman fund inside a BVI holding company, and the original source of the money becomes almost untraceable. This is not illegal. It is, in fact, routine. Thousands of legitimate investment funds use these structures every day. But it also means that when someone wants to hide the origin of capital, the tools are already built and waiting. According to ProPublica's reporting, this is precisely the mechanism that was used. Chinese investors allegedly funneled capital through Cayman-registered funds, which then purchased SpaceX shares on the secondary market. The shares changed hands, the money moved, and on paper the buyer was not Chinese at all. It was a fund, domiciled in a jurisdiction with no obligation to disclose its investors. A clean transaction with a dirty origin. The system worked, until it did not. But here is where things get strange. In October 2025, ProPublica published a follow-up report that introduced a key figure, Iqbaljit Kahlon, a fund manager who had been operating at the center of this network. Kahlon testified in court, under oath, that he had brokered SpaceX share purchases for Chinese investors on multiple occasions. This was not speculation. This was sworn testimony. And Kahlon's name appeared in another proceeding entirely. One that would reveal even more about how this system worked and where it broke down. The case was Leo Investments Hong Kong Limited versus Tomales Bay Capital, filed in the Delaware Court of Chancery, one of the most important business courts in the world, under docket number 2-022-0175, JTL. The judgment was handed down on June 30, 2025. The facts of the case read like a manual for how offshore investment structures can go wrong. Leo Investments was a Hong Kong-based entity, an investment vehicle connected to what court documents described as a Chinese investor group. Through Kahlon's fund, Leo had committed $50 million. That fund, in turn, used the capital to purchase SpaceX shares on the secondary market. For a time, the arrangement worked. The money flowed in, the shares were acquired, and no one at SpaceX appeared to notice or question where the capital had originated. But at some point, that changed. SpaceX learned or was informed that the fund contained investors linked to China. The company's response was immediate and unambiguous. It would not sell shares to any fund with Chinese investor participation. The door was shut. Kahlon was now in an impossible position. He had a fiduciary obligation to his fund's investors, but he also had a counterparty, SpaceX, that was refusing to do business if Chinese capital remained in the structure. He chose SpaceX. He returned Leo Investments $50 million and removed them from the fund entirely without, according to the court, providing adequate explanation or advance notice. Leo sued, arguing they had been wrongfully expelled from a profitable investment. The court ultimately ruled in Kahlon's favor on the central question. It applied the business judgment rule, a legal doctrine that gives managers broad discretion over operational decisions, finding that his choice to comply with SpaceX's policy was a legitimate exercise of managerial authority. However, the court also found that Kahlon had breached his duty of good faith. He had failed to adequately inform Leo of what was happening and why. For that breach, the damages awarded were exactly $1. $1 for $50 million worth of lost opportunity. The symbolism was hard to miss. But here is what makes this case so significant. It proved two things simultaneously. First, that SpaceX did have a policy to exclude Chinese capital. The Leo case showed the policy being enforced. Second, and far more troublingly, that other routes around that policy continued to function. Kahlon himself testified that he had facilitated multiple Chinese investments. The Leo case was the one that got caught. The question was, how many others did not? ProPublica put the offshore structure to 13 national security experts. 12 of them reached the same conclusion. The use of Cayman and BVI entities to invest in SpaceX had no plausible explanation other than concealing Chinese ownership. Andrew Verstein, a law professor at UCLA, described it as, quote, clearly an obfuscation policy and potentially a very serious problem. SpaceX declined to comment. Musk said nothing. But the real gravity of the situation only becomes clear when you look at what SpaceX actually does for the United States government. The cumulative value of SpaceX's federal contracts exceeds $22 billion. That figure alone is staggering. But the nature of those contracts is what elevates this from a financial story to a national security crisis. Start with Starshield. This is not Starlink. Starshield is a classified satellite network built for the National Reconnaissance Office under an $1.8 billion contract. It operates at least 183 reconnaissance satellites, spacecraft designed to collect intelligence at the highest classification levels. The clearance required to access Starshield data is TS-SCI, Top Secret, Sensitive Compartmented Information. This is the most restricted category of classified material in the United States. In April 2025, the Pentagon awarded SpaceX an additional $5.9 billion in launch contracts. Then there is Golden Dome, a missile defense initiative that would place approximately 600 tracking satellites in orbit at an estimated cost of $2 billion. These satellites are designed to detect and track incoming ballistic missiles from space. And Starlink itself, the commercial network, has already been deployed in an active combat zone. During the war in Ukraine, Ukrainian forces relied on Starlink terminals for frontline military communications. Drone operators coordinated strikes through Starlink. Field commanders received orders through Starlink. It was not a demonstration or a pilot program. It was the backbone of wartime communication for an entire military. Consider what this means in aggregate. SpaceX builds the satellites that spy on adversaries. It launches the payloads that carry America's most sensitive military hardware into orbit. It is developing the system that would track incoming nuclear missiles, and it already provides the communication infrastructure for an allied nation at war. If there is a single private company on Earth where foreign ownership should be scrutinized with absolute rigor, it is this one. And yet, the allegation remains. Chinese capital may already be inside, concealed behind offshore shells registered thousands of miles from Washington. The United States has a mechanism designed to address exactly this kind of risk. It is called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Established during the Cold War and strengthened repeatedly since, CFIUS is an interagency body chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. It includes representatives from the Departments of Defense, State, Commerce, Energy, and Homeland Security. Its purpose is to review foreign acquisitions and investments that could threaten national security. It has the authority to block transactions, impose conditions, or force divestiture, even retroactively, after a deal has already closed. There is also FUAC, Foreign Ownership, Control, or Influence, a separate set of regulations administered by the Department of Defense. FUAC applies specifically to companies that hold or seek facility security clearances. If a defense contractor is found to be under foreign influence, it can be stripped of its clearance, effectively barring it from classified work. As of May 2024, FOCI requirements were expanded to cover all contracts valued at $5 million or more. SpaceX holds contracts worth billions, and there is precedent for action. When the Chinese gaming company Beijing Kunlun Tech acquired Grindr, the dating app, CFIUS intervened and forced a complete divestiture. The concern was not about dating, it was about the personal data of millions of Americans, including military personnel, location data, private messages, identity information, in the hands of a Chinese-owned company. TikTok faced a similar reckoning. CFIUS-driven legislation demanded a structural overhaul to separate American user data from Chinese parent company ByteDance. The argument was that a social media algorithm controlled from Beijing posed a risk to information security and democratic discourse. PatientsLikeMe, a health data platform where users shared sensitive medical histories, was also forced to divest after a Chinese acquisition. A dating app, a social media platform, a health data website, all deemed serious enough to trigger forced action. And yet, as of April 2026, no equivalent action has been taken regarding SpaceX, a company that builds spy satellites, launches nuclear-capable missile tracking systems, and holds some of the most restricted security clearances in the country. Senators Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Andy Kim of New Jersey sent their letter to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on February 5, 2026. It contained 11 specific questions about the Chinese investment allegations. It demanded answers by February 20th. That deadline passed. No response was issued. 2 months later, the questions remain unanswered. The 5 central questions still hanging in the air are these. First, what is the actual percentage of SpaceX equity held, directly or indirectly, by Chinese investors? That figure remains undisclosed. Second, has CFIUS opened a formal investigation? no public confirmation exists. Third, given SpaceX's access to TS-SCI programs like Starshield and Golden Dome, what is the potential exposure if ownership is compromised? That assessment has not been made public. Fourth, what is SpaceX's official position? The company has declined to comment. Musk has said nothing. Fifth, if CFIUS were to act, what would the remedy look like? The Grindr and TikTok precedents suggest forced restructuring or divestiture, but SpaceX is orders of magnitude more complex. There is one more dimension to this story that is easy to overlook. China is not sitting idle in the satellite race. The Qianfan constellation, backed by Shanghai's municipal government, has a target of 15,000 satellites, but currently operates roughly 90. The Guowang Network, a state-backed initiative, aims for nearly 13,000. Against SpaceX's 10,202 operational satellites, the gap is enormous, more than 100 to 1. But the ambition and the investment are accelerating. This creates a paradox. China is simultaneously racing to build its own satellite infrastructure while, allegedly, finding ways to invest in the company that dominates the very market it is trying to enter. Whether the motivation is financial return, strategic intelligence, or simply the prestige of owning a piece of Musk's empire, the national security implications are the same. And so the situation stands. A trillion-dollar company, deeply embedded in American national security infrastructure, with sworn testimony and investigative evidence suggesting that Chinese capital penetrated its ownership structure through offshore vehicles. The mechanisms designed to catch exactly this kind of threat have so far produced no public response. The senators asked their questions. The Pentagon said nothing. The company said nothing. And the money, wherever it came from, remains inside. There was a time when the greatest risks to national security came from stolen documents, intercepted signals, or turned agents. The espionage was dramatic. It involved dead drops and double agents, and encrypted radio transmissions. It was the stuff of novels and films. Today, the risk may be quieter. A wire transfer routed through the right jurisdiction. A fund structured to obscure its investors. A share purchase that technically complied with every rule except the one that mattered most. No agents were turned. No safes were cracked. No classified documents changed hands. Instead, a financial instrument was created in the Cayman Islands. Capital was wired from Asia, and shares in the most sensitive private company on Earth were purchased, legally, quietly, and without triggering a single alarm. The full scope of what happened inside SpaceX's investor base has never been publicly disclosed. The number of Chinese-linked investors remains unknown. The total capital involved remains unknown. The degree of access, if any, that ownership confers remains unknown. Whether any of these questions will ever be answered is itself an open question. But the structure that allowed it to happen is not a secret. It is sitting in plain sight, registered on a small island in the Caribbean, waiting to be used again.